the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today is the commemoration of the beheading of St. John the Baptist. It's a fast day, but because it's a weekend, we'll have wine and oil if we wish, but no fish. Because we're recognizing the exploits of St. John the Baptist, of whom the Lord said that no greater man was born of woman than the Baptist. However, the least in heaven is greater than he. So on the earth, he's the greatest. In heaven, I think he's second to the Theotokos. I want to tell you a tale of tragedy and triumph today. And I want you to put yourself in the positions of these people that are in the story. That's what we should do when we read the Scriptures. We should compare ourselves, both positively and negatively. Things we should want to do and things that we know that we shouldn't be doing by reading the Scriptures and seeing these examples. So there are John the Baptist, and there's Herod the king, there's Herodias, there's the damsel who danced, and there is the sycophants that were around Herod that came for the party. All of them perished with the exception of John. Only one of them lived a righteous life. All the rest of them were lacking terribly in many ways. So let's talk about them. First, let's talk about the good. Let's talk about the baptizer. So John the Baptist, he was courageous. He was bold. He was moral, uncompromising with the world. Why? Because God was within him. Because he lived piously and with love for God. And so he had this incredible zeal to be the last prophet of the Old Testament. I suppose one could say Jesus was a prophet. Of course he's a prophet, but he's sort of like the prophet of the new, the turnover from the old to the new. But he's the last prophet of the Old Testament. And he lived uncompromisingly. He lived courageously. He wasn't afraid to censure those in power. So he censured Herod, who had taken Philip's wife, his brother's wife, because Herodias was, she was a temptress. She was a psychopath, probably. In our modern day parlance, she was probably a psychopath. She was an evil woman. And so she seduced Herod and had all the power and the glory that Herod had. And she had him probably twisted around her little finger. And St. John the Baptist rebuked him for this. And Herod, who was really not a pious person at all, not even a Jew, he feared John, but he also followed his wife. So he compromised between those two, and he put John in prison. But he wouldn't let his wife put John to death. And John remained in prison, and he was a presence even to Herod. Herod, as this Gospel of St. Mark says, very descriptively, that he heard him gladly. Herod would go into the prison and listen to John talk. The man who had rebuked him about his illegal marriage, his immoral marriage, his fornication. And yet he heard John gladly. But he was a weak man. He was a man that was overcome by his passions for power and capriciousness and for the lust of glory, for the lust for women, and comfort, self-indulgence. So he did love John. He didn't put him to death. He had the power to do it, but he didn't do it because he actually liked John, even though John, I'm sure, rebuked him when he saw him. That's a very interesting detail that is only in St. Mark's Gospel. And of course, now let's go to the rest of them. So Herod is weak, loved John, but didn't love him enough. Maybe he had some religious scruples, but not very many, because his major religion was the idolatry of self. And so he came to a time when he was going to have a birthday, and he wanted just to have a grand soiree so he could have lots of drink and lots of food, drunkenness, frivolity, and Herodias, of course, would be there in all her finery, observing the scene. And she arranged, I'm sure, to have Herodias, her daughter, come and dance. Now, when he says dance, that's a kind of a euphemism. She did something erotic and obscene. And it was pleasing to all the drunken men as they were gaping at her. And Herod was pleased. That's how the evangelist puts it. Herod was inflamed with lust. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the lust of a man who's rich enough to do anything he wants, the lust of self-indulgence, and of not caring about anybody but themselves. And he was pleased. But his judgment was impaired, partially by his lust for power in general, and secondarily by the amount of wine he had had. And he went to Herodias and said, "You can have anything you want. Ask me anything up to half of my kingdom." Foolish thing to say, but he was drunk. And his wife, the evil woman, immediately went to her daughter and said, "Ask for the head of John." Now Herod was unhappy about this. He liked John. He would like to go see John. Maybe there was something in Herod's heart that said, I'm black and wicked. I'd like to be better. John is bright. I like to be around John, even though he rebukes me. So there was something good in Herod. We can't say Herod was completely terrible, because he preserved John until he made a promise, and then he was afraid to go back on his promise. Now, if you make a promise to do something stupid, then don't do it. If you make a promise to do something that's sinful and horrible, then don't do it. Go back on the promise. Absolutely. But Herod didn't do that because he didn't want to lose face, and because his wife had such control over him. And he didn't want to appear weak. Probably a lot of that is because if you appear weak, then somebody says, I can come stick a knife in this guy's side and I'll be king. Because they're always looking over their shoulder. So there were many passions at play here that made Herod unable to act according to morality, according to his actual desires. So he said, go ahead. And it talks about in the scriptures, it says, she came, and this is when the Herodias came, and she came with haste to the king and said, I want the head of John the Baptist. This word haste, it was done hastily. Herod was afraid. Herodias came in, and it was done hastily that she said, I want the head of John the Baptist. Herod was afraid to look weak in the presence of all these grandees, so he hastily said to a soldier to go execute him and bring the head. This haste. What kind of haste do you have? Do you have haste to do good? Do you have haste to say your prayers? Do you have haste to love your enemies? Or do you have haste to do the things according to your liking? Do you have haste to idolize yourself or to worship God? We should do things with haste, but we should do things with haste like Zacchaeus did. When he was said, come down, and with haste he came down out of the tree. That's the way we should make haste, is make haste to do good and not to do good, to do bad. And the crowd, what did they do? All the people that were enjoying the fine food, the copious amounts of wine, the drunkenness, the lewd dancing, the frivolity, what did they do? They didn't say a word. Not one word. They were silent in the face of this terrible murder. And so St. John's head was brought and eventually was thrown into a manure pile, and it was recovered, and we actually have 3 feasts of the first, second, and third findings of the head of John the Baptist. And they're a happier feast than this one. But on this feast day, we fast in respect for St. John the Baptist. What kind of person are you among these people? Are you like John? It's the only one that'll get you saved. To be with courage, with a moral way of living. In our day, most people are not like John. They might say some of John's morality, but they're not really like him. Because the world is pushing all the time, pushing upon us, and it's making its inroads into the Orthodox Church for sure. Absolutely. I've been telling you this for a long time. The pandemic brought a lot of it out. But there's a lot of people that say they're Christians, but they don't act like it at all. They don't think like it at all. They cave in right away. They're a little house of cards. Well, how strong are you? How strong are you if you might lose your job because of your faith? If you might have to give in like the grandees of Herod and be quiet about something. Are you like that? Well, if you're like that, then it's dangerous. It's dangerous for you. This is not like 1950 or 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 in this country. Now, 1950 in Russia was tough. 1960 in Russia was tough. 72. But this kind of freedom that we are enjoying, we're not always going to have this freedom. So are you going to be free in your heart, in your soul? You're going to be free like John? Because you know what is right and what is wrong, and you live according to it, and you're not afraid to do it? I was just reading the life of a saint, and I don't remember his name, unfortunately, but it really impressed me. And that's a good thing about having not a perfect memory. You read the lives of the saints every year, and you go, "Oh, this is wonderful. I haven't read this before. I've read it 6 times before." That's why I write a lot of them down and pray for them every day, because I want to keep the remembrance of them in my heart. But anyway, this saint, there was a terrible persecution, and it was about icons. And he went around preaching of the correct faith, knowing it was going to get him killed. Now, you could hold to the right faith, but you could do it quietly. You could have an icon in your home, maybe. You could go to church. But if you go to the town square and start talking about icons, then eventually the emperor's soldiers are going to get you and you're going to lose your head. And that's what happened to him. Actually, he was tortured before losing his head. But he wasn't quiet about it. He was like St. John. Now, I'm not saying that every one of us is called to be that person. Absolutely. That's not true. Only some people are called to that kind of ministry where they literally sacrifice themselves knowing that they'll die. There were many bishops during the Soviet yoke that were like that. They knew. I remember one, I don't remember who it was. It might have been Peter of Krtitsa. When he was made a bishop, he was basically told, "You're going to die." And he accepted that yoke. And many bishops were like that. Many priests were like that. They still preached. They still taught. Some of them taught quietly. Some of them taught loudly. Sometimes the loud ones got away with it, and sometimes the quiet ones got persecuted. But in general, if there's a malevolent government and you start talking about things against the government, it's likely that you're going to be arrested. You're going to be tortured or deprogrammed in our day, and maybe fall into a hole and nobody sees you again. Those kinds of things can happen. St. John wasn't afraid of those things because he had a calling, because he knew what his purpose was. Besides the purpose of everyone, the salvation of the soul, the knowledge of God, to have union with God, his temporal purpose was to be a prophet of God and to prepare the way. And there was nothing going to stop him from doing that. We should be like John. But we can't be like John unless we are not like the others. And maybe that sounds obvious and silly to put it that way. Of course, if you're like John, you're not like the others. But if there's a piece of the others in you, you'll never be like John. If there's a piece of Herod in you where you're afraid of the truth, but you're attracted to it, you're afraid to act upon the truth, but you're attracted to it, that's not like John at all. If you're addicted to your passions, to lust or to whatever other passion that you might be addicted to, you can't be like John at all. If you're, of course, the other ones are, there's nothing really redeeming whatsoever about Herodias or the damsel, or I forgot her name now, but her it's in the life. Or the people that are just sitting around not talking about what's going on. It's not saying this is wrong to do. We have to have courage. We have to live with courage. There's really no replacement for it. And in our day, if you're a courageous Christian and you live according to the truth, you're labeled. You're even labeled by some in the church. People are afraid of those labels. You know the nursery rhyme. It's not true, is it? Huh? About sticks and stones. Names hurt people. Names hurt people a lot. But we shouldn't be afraid. We have a name. And the name is that we are children of God. The name is that we are made in the image of God and we are God's. That is, we belong to God. We even are God's, according to the Psalter. That is, we should have control over our life, control over our passions, live as kings and queens of ourselves, that with dignity, as John lived. None of the others lived with any dignity. They were like reeds to and fro, blown by the wind. They were men who lived in soft houses, and wore soft clothing, and lived in great houses, and feasted it sumptuously every day. That's not what Christianity is. Christianity is live according to your convictions. So, as the days go on, you're going to be challenged. I don't know what your challenges are going to be. I don't know what mine are going to be. But I guarantee you we're going to have challenges. And we'll be equal to those challenges if we have God in our heart. If we live in a spiritual way of life, then we'll be equal to those challenges. May God help us to be equal to those challenges. May God help us to be like John, and through the prayers of St. John, may we be saved. Amen.